is a long-term follow-up study of a group of people who first had a clinically isolated syndrome, a first attack that could be the first sign of MS, on average 15 years ago. Now, I just want to take one step back and just talk about what is a clinically isolated syndrome. So it's a first episode of inflammation affecting the nervous system. So an MS relapse or an MS attack or exacerbation is usually due to an area of inflammation in the nervous system. The very first one, this one here, before anything else has happened, that's the clinically isolated syndrome, because at that stage it's isolated, there's only been one. And prior to having MRI scans, we couldn't make a diagnosis of MS at that time. Not everyone who has a clinically isolated syndrome does develop MS. It's been between 2/3 to 3/4 of people. So in some people it's just a one-off episode and nothing else happens. But in the majority of people, that they will go on to develop MS to have further attacks. Now these are the three, I just want to talk you through the three common ways, three common clinically isolated syndromes. And the first is optic neuritis, which was heard mentioned before. And so here is someone who's got problems with vision in their left eye, and they've got this area of inflammation, swelling, and inflammation here in the optic nerve that causes a change in vision, usually in the one eye, and it can range from a bit of cloudiness right through to severe loss of vision, usually with a bit of pain as well. That's about 1/3 of people with a clinically isolated syndrome have that problem. A smaller number of people have an attack of inflammation here in the brainstem. Sorry guys, it's your turn again over here. There. And that can cause difficulty like double vision, numbness in the face, imbalance or dizziness. And then the most common, about half of people will have some inflammation in the spinal cord as their presenting symptom of MS, causing numbness or the Lermite symptom when the neck's bent forward, the tingling going through the body, occasionally weakness in the legs, sometimes bladder or bowel problems. So why should we be studying people with this clinically isolated syndrome rather than people who've got MS? Why would we do that? Well, we think that it's important to study MS from the very beginning of the illness. And in most people with relapsing, remitting MS, this is the very beginning, or at least the first time it becomes apparent. It's also the time that people frequently go along to see a neurologist for the first time, or an ophthalmologist if they've got troubles with their vision. And they're often, the prospect or the possibility of MS is usually raised at that point. And increasingly, as I mentioned before, it's often a time where we need to start thinking about, well, should we be putting this person on treatment? Now, the prognosis for people who have a clinically isolated syndrome is quite variable and quite difficult to predict. In the 1980s at Queen Square, they got together a group of 140 people with a clinically isolated syndrome, and in the mid-2000s they followed them up after 20 years to find out how they all were. Now they didn't follow them up at the clinic, but they tried to track them down, they tried to find out how everybody was, irrespective of whether they were seeing neurologists or not. What they found out was that about 1/3 of people had not had any more attacks. They just had that one episode, whether it be optic neuritis or some inflammation in the spinal cord, myelitis. About half of those people, although they'd not had any more attacks, had changes on the MRI scan that looked for everything in the world like multiple sclerosis. And those people probably have the most mild form of MS possible, where they just had a single attack, and after 20 years they've only developed changes on the scan, but nothing else has happened. The next 1/3 of people had gone on to have further attacks. They'd developed relapsing, remitting MS, but they had little physical disability. That's what some neurologists would call benign MS. Now, I don't really like that term, and I think it's falling out of favour, because just because you've got very little physical disability doesn't mean that MS isn't having a significant impact on your life. So some of this third of people, although they didn't have any problems with their walking, for example, might have disabling fatigue or problems with concentration, memory, thinking, and so forth. The last third of people were disabled, and they were either disabled because they'd had attacks, relapsing remitting MS with attacks that they'd not recovered from, there'd been some permanent damage to the nervous system, or, more significantly, their MS had changed. And instead of having relapsing remitting MS, they'd developed secondary progressive MS, which we know occurs after 5, 10, 15, 20 years of having relapsing remitting MS in a proportion of people. Now, MRI is helpful to an extent in giving us information about which of these three groups people might fall into. If you have lesions on the scan at the time you have your clinically isolated syndrome, optic neuritis or inflammation in the brainstem, then you've got an 80% chance of developing MS in the future. If you've got a perfectly normal scan, and some people do, then your risk of MS is really very low. Coming back to these patients, though, that I showed you right at the very beginning, the scan's not very good at telling us, which of the groups people are going to fall into, whether the MS is going to run a more mild course or a more severe course. And really, the aims of my research are to try and address this problem. So, firstly, whether there's any early changes on MRI scans that can predict how people are going to be in the long term that have MS. And secondly, and more importantly actually going forward, is to understand what is the major cause of long-term disability. Why do people have these very different experiences over time? So to try and answer some of these questions, I'm in the process of following up 178 people who first had a clinically isolated syndrome, on average 15 years ago. So they came into this research study between 1995 and 2004 at the time that they first had problems. And they were mainly people with optic neuritis, actually, that went to the Moorfields Eye Hospital, which is a big eye hospital in London, and then a smaller number of people that came to the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, where I also work now, who had other syndromes that might be the first manifestation of MS. As part of the study, people came at the time of their initial symptoms, on average 5 weeks after the start of those very first symptoms, and they came and had some MRI scans with us. And then, irrespective of how they were, we invited them to come back after 3 months, 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. So not just the people who were having problems, but everyone, we asked them to come back. So they were having MRI scans done, even if they were totally fine. And so we've got a large amount of information to look back on. The last time they were seen, they came after 5 years, so there was research money to see them until the 5-year follow-up. And so the last time these people were contacted was between 2000 and 2008. So my first job was to try and track this 178 people down. And I don't know if anyone's got children in London or family that have moved to London. It's a very transient place. People often stay there for a short period of time. And a lot of people had moved. And it's been an interesting process for me trying to find everyone, to get in touch with them, to find out how they are after all this time. And you can see New Zealand's well represented. We've had a couple of people move to New Zealand or back to New Zealand after being in London. And we're actually lucky enough to have one of those people here with us today. So Jeanette, I'm not sure if you want to wave, but Jeanette's been part of the research study that I'm going to present today. And she's actually come for her 15-year MRI scan already, luckily at the same time as her and her husband were visiting some family back in the UK last year. So it's great to have her with us. People coming for the study, we're doing a very detailed assessment on how they are. So we're measuring their physical disability in ways that are done in quite a standard way in MS with what's called the EDSS and another measure called the MSFC. We're trying to think beyond physical health, so people are also having detailed cognitive tests done to understand what effect MS might be having on problems like concentration and memory and thinking. We're also asking people about fatigue, depression and anxiety, which we know are issues that are more common in people with MS. We're checking on their vision. When you ask people with MS to list their most disabling symptoms, vision's number 3 or 4 on most lists, which is really interesting. And we're also doing some genetic testing, which I'm not going to discuss in too much detail today. I'm mainly focusing on the MRI. We know that genetics are important to a degree in MS, in terms of the risk of developing MS, but what we're less sure about is whether genetics might be one of the reasons why some people stay quite well in the long run and other people can have a more disabling course. Our main research tool is the MRI, and I'm going to be showing you some pictures of MRI scans later, and this is a research quality MRI. So an ordinary MRI that you might have at the Auckland Hospital, you might be in the scanner for 20-25 minutes if it's just a standard brain MRI. This MRI protocol goes for almost 2 hours. Okay? So in an ordinary MRI, we might take 25 slices of the brain. We get 50 slices with this. Luckily for us, these people are professional MRI people. You know, they've had all these scans as part of the study, and everyone that I've had so far has been totally fine being in the scanner for such a long time. They go in for just over an hour, then they have a little break, and they go back in for about another 35 minutes. So it's sort of almost 2 hours all up. I've had the MRI scan done 17 times, and that's because you can't ring people, get them to come in until you've got everything all perfect. So most of my first 6 months was spent having MRI scans.